Well, welcome everybody to the June issue of the South Dakota Forest Health Workshop Series. Today, Dr. John Ball will be discussing defoliating and sap-sucking insects as we move into the summer months. Trees are emerging, and so are the bugs. So Dr. Ball has some timely information on what you might be seeing in your backyard and throughout South Dakota. As we get started, I do want to remind you that this workshop is being recorded. The recording is going to be placed on our department's YouTube channel where you can view past workshops. Currently, we have a dozen different workshops that are posted on that YouTube channel on a single playlist. I'll be happy to put that playlist link in the chat before the day our day is out here. If you have any interest in getting continued education credits for either Society of American Forester Certified Arborist or for International Society of Arboriculture Certified Arborist, you please stay tuned to the end of the workshop. Dr. Ball will have a code for Certified Arborist, and if you are a Certified Forester, please put your information, your credentials in the chat box before the day is over. I hope everybody can hear me.
I certainly can. So
okay. So we should be through the boilerplate information. Dr. Ball, yes. I'll pass it to you.
Yeah.
All right, you ready? We keep getting somebody popping up here all the time with talks. All right, let's see if they wants to share. And let's go into it. All right, now I'll do the usual. Tony, I'm assuming you can see the screen, correct?
We're looking good. I can hear you and I can see you.
All right. You'll see me not as a video. For some reason, that shut off with this one. But anyway, you don't need to look at me. You just need to look at the pictures. So thanks, everyone, for participating today. What we're going to do is kind of a relatively quick update as to what's going on for defoliating and sap-sucking insects. And I'm really going to focus on those you're seeing right now, or ones that need to be treated right now rather than those that occur throughout the season. I'm going to do them by the type of damage that they cause. And so we'll start out with the leaf chewers. These are the ones that devour the entire leaf, though sometimes a couple of the veins will still remain at the base. These are the ones where people go out and go, oh my goodness, almost the entire leaf is gone. Now, before I even start those, I do want to let everyone know that the spring was fairly hard on a lot of trees, and there are a lot of maples, ash, and a number of other trees that are just breaking bud now. In fact, the top of the tree, or maybe the upper 2/3 of the tree, had no leaves a few weeks ago, and now they're starting to send out leaves. So I had a lot of calls and emails from people asking me what's feeding on their tree, and frankly, there was nothing feeding on the tree. The leaves just had not formed yet. So let's try not to confuse defoliation damage with frost and just frankly cold weather injury. A lot of our leaf feeding insects will not devour the complete leaf. If you're not looking at anything, it's rarely one of our defoliators. It can happen, but it's incredibly rare. They always leave a little bit of the crust to their sandwich, so to speak, and you'll have something to it. The ones I want to mention right now are the elm sawflies. Now, the elm sawfly larvae are not out yet, and they are kind of interesting. They literally curl around the leaf, and elm sawfly apparently didn't pass its woody plant ID class in college because they feed on more than elms. As you probably can guess from this picture, they also feed on willows. So they have quite a wide range of what they'll feed. This is a picture of elm sawfly defoliation on an elm up near Aberdeen. In fact, between a time period that they called and said, hey, we're seeing these worms on the tree, to 3 days later when I arrived, it had been almost completely defoliated. And with a lot of our sawflies, you're going to be left with this, that you'll have bits of leaf still, the bases, the crust, so to speak, but not much else to it. And there's what the larvae look like, and they'll crawl on the bark too. But the reason I'm mentioning them today is that if you take a look, the defoliation really is going to be later this year. It's going to be in August and September. So I don't anticipate you're going to see any of this for about another month or so. But the adults are out right now, and the adults are out laying eggs along the leaf veins. And the reason I mention it is the adult. The adult elm sawfly adult, and they're found throughout the state, is one of the largest sawflies out there. And because of that, people confuse it with a hornet. And this is one of the most common insects submitted as that murder hornet, the hornet that came from Asia that does injure people. And so it's high on the radar for a lot of folks. But what I want you to notice is that big white disc or light colored disc on the thorax, right there by the wings. If you see that, and it'll be big, I mean, an inch or so, what you're looking at is an elm sawfly rather than the murder hornet, which as far as we know has not made its way to South Dakota. But I know I'm going to get a couple of calls on this over the next couple of weeks, people saying, oh my goodness, I found this huge wasp. Now they are a hymenoptera, so they're related, but no fear. They're going to lay eggs. They're going to slit and make eggs, places to place their eggs along the veins of leaves. They're not going to try to lay eggs on people. This is a new one. And I will admit, for everyone watching this, this is very limited distribution, but I thought I had to show it to you just because it's fascinating. This is pine looper. Now, a lot of you are saying, I've never heard of it before, and you probably haven't, and you'll probably never hear of it again. It's that rare of a phenomena, and it's been very localized. There is one long ridge down by Pringle, South Dakota, out in the Black Hills, that is almost completely defoliated. And this happened last August. People started noticing these worms dropping out of their pine trees. And so I went out to take a look at it, and oh my goodness, look at that. There's very few needles on these trees. They were almost completely devoured, but as I mentioned before, when we say it's a leaf chewer, that doesn't mean every leaf, all the leaves will be missing, but most of them will be, or you'll be left with a lot of stubs. And so you went out there, and here on the Black Hills National Forest, as well as a lot of the private properties that were kind of fitting among the forest holdings, these trees were just bare. And that's what a pine looper looks like. I actually had to circle it with those dashed yellow lines just so you could say, oh my goodness, there is an insect there, because they look a lot like a twig, don't they? A twig without leaves or needles. And so they're kind of difficult to find on the plant. The problem is they drop, and they were literally crawling up and down houses. People were worried about their dogs eating them. Not that any dog would probably want to devour this. But I mean, they're crawling. It was a mess. I mean, imagine sitting out in your patio and having these crawling across you as they're trying to find another tree to move to defoliate, because they'll do that. They'll go back and forth and up and down. Well, this year, the trees are rebudding. And I told all the landowners to expect that pines can tolerate 1 year of defoliation. Now, again, if they're in a drought, that's going to be kind of hard on them, but otherwise they can make it. And they've actually had a little rain down there. And so the trees are breaking bud and looking pretty good. But here's the problem. The overwinter is pupae in the soil. Now, the last outbreak we had of this was about 2003. Before that, it was 1972. And generally, defoliation only occurs 1 year, and the population just plummets. Now, these pupae, for example, and they're in the pupal stage from about September until June. Those are pretty easy for mice, voles, everything else munching along to find. And there's a couple of fungal diseases that attack them and a few other things. So they're pretty vulnerable in that stage. And typically what happens is they disappear, but not this time. When we were out looking about a week ago, we were able to find somewhere up to 5 to 8 live pupae per foot in the forest. So we're going to start monitoring for adult emergence. And in fact, adults have started to emerge. Our concern, of course, and this happened in 72, that the trees can take 1 year defoliation and come back. They can't take 2. And so if we're going to get a lot of emergence in this area, and if they're laying eggs along the needles, those new needles that are forming, then what that tells us is people are going to have to spray this year in order to keep the trees from defoliated a second time. So stay tuned on this one. I'll update you as we go. By the way, I might also mention that the emerald ash borer is started to fly. That's not a defoliator, though the adults feed on a little bit of the foliage, but we started getting adult emergence about a week or so ago, about Memorial Day, just right on schedule. They'll be out there feeding on the edges of ash leaves, but obviously the real problem is they bore into the ash trees as larvae. The other one you can find out right now as an adult is the ash gray blister beetles. These are predominantly found in the Black Hills, but I can find them in Sioux Falls, Minnehaha County. Now, way you have to find these is you have to have a house next to an alfalfa field, generally speaking, because they spend a lot of their time in alfalfa. But you're out there mowing your lawn and you notice these very slow moving insects that are feeding on a wide range of plants or standing on them. Now, the blister beetles typically go for legumes, and obviously the picture you're seeing here is of a hackberry, but they'll land on anything and walk around for a bit, or mate in this case. But if you go out and notice that your honey locust is defoliated, by that most of the leaves are missing, over 3 days, or your pea shrub is defoliated that quickly, and you happen to be near an alfalfa field, like you're on one of those communities at the edge of one of those neighborhoods at the edge of community, you're probably looking at these, and they're very easy to find. They're slow-moving insects. Do not touch them. They get the name blister beetle because the adults spray, kind of like a skunk, a chemical that will cause your skin just to bubble and swell into these watery blisters. It's not very pleasant, and it's not very comfortable. There's a good example of defoliation on a honey locust. I mean, you can see through the tree. Just some of the stalks are present. But as I mentioned, the adults are out now, and the adults are the concern for everybody here because the adults are defoliators. So they are defoliating alfalfa, but it's going to be the honey locust and the pea shrubs, which are their 2 favorite in urban areas. And just the mere fact they might land on you and you smack one and now you're covered with that blistery fluid are the bad things. The eggs are laid in late summer in the soil, and then the larvae are actually beneficial to us. The larvae feed on grasshopper eggs. And so here you have an insect that, from our standpoint, is beneficial as larvae, but not as adults, because as adults, they feed on the plants that we like, and they also end up defoliating or causing blisters on us as well. Well, the other one I'm getting a lot of calls from right now, of course, are the tent caterpillars. And what people are noticing are the nests appearing in the branches of a number of tree species. Cherries are one of their favorites, as well as crab apples and that. But I've even received pictures on Russian olive. So they do have a wide host range. They can feed on just about anything as larvae. We do have 3 different tent caterpillars in the state. We have the eastern tent caterpillar, which I just showed you, that's found East River. The western tent caterpillar that's found West River. Notice there's a slight color change, but other than that, are very similar. And then there's the forest tent caterpillar, which forms these very characteristic keyhole pattern on the abdomen. We find those in the Northeast. You get up to Marshall County, you'll find them there in the forest. And last year they caused tremendous defoliation up there. We'll see what happens this year, but I haven't got a lot of calls on it, fortunately. But I get calls on the others because there you are, a little cherry. And now they're just starting to come out of the nest. Now, up to now, the easiest control was just tear the nest open. If you tear the nest open, lots of things that are trying to feed on them can get to them. And so that's a real easy way to do control. But otherwise, what you're going to notice is you're going to find the larvae feeding in and now outside of the nest. At that point, treatments become a little more difficult. You're spraying the caterpillars to kill them. The smaller they are, the less pesticide it takes to kill them and the less damage they've done. What often happens is people wait until the caterpillars are about 1.5 inches or so long. They've finished up their feeding. They're just getting ready to pupate in cocoons on trees and buildings, and that's when we spray them. That's revenge spraying. They've already done all the damage they're going to do. So now is the time to get out there and apply any chemical treatment now that they're moving outside the nest. And there's a lot of pesticides that are very effective against these. We also have leaf skeletonizers, and you can see that from the linden there. They'll take an entire leaf and chew down to the veins. So they can be similar to a leaf chewer, but in this case, the veins will be left. And sometimes you get a very much a lacy pattern over the plant because they'll even leave the smaller veins. The one you need to be looking for now are Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles, adults, are starting to come out, and I've already been getting some pictures of grape leaves, hydrangeas, lindens. Those tend to be their favorite foods in urban areas. And there's one of the adults. Now, the adults are very colorful, as you can see, but the way to tell you're looking at a Japanese beetle adult is you get those tufts of white hair that run along the margin of the abdomen. The other thing you'll probably notice is you usually find them in groups. They'll be clustered on the flowers, for example, of roses, another one of their favorite foods. But they're just starting to come out now. The larvae are C-shaped grubs that feed on roots, for example, turf roots, so they're not noticed, but their damage is. But right about now, calls are starting to come in. I'm finding these beetles in clusters on, again, roses, hydrangeas, lindens, or grapes. What are they? Well, they are the adults, the Japanese beetles. And there are treatments that you can do to kill the adults as they're feeding on the leaves. I would caution against using the traps. You can buy Japanese beetle traps, but they tend to attract the beetles from considerable distance. And as they get closer to the trap, they lose interest in it and they'll start going to plants. Worst thing you do is put a Japanese beetle trap next to a rose garden. You've just about guaranteed that the roses are going to be devoured. We get window painting. This is kind of like skeletonization, but they leave either the upper or lower tissue of the leaf, hence the name window panes. And we have one that really does that here, causing this painting. It is the pear slug. Okay, and the pear slug is kind of colorful. There's 2 generations per year. Right now, we're in one that's causing these. It looks like a very small snail, if you will. Pear sawfly is the other name because it is a sawfly. And they're just starting to feed away on there. I'm finding them on purple leaf sand cherry quite a bit. But if you go out there and look, you'll notice all this kind of pattern to the leaf, and that's what's doing. Now, these are very easily killed by any contact insecticide. The biggest thing is people often miss them until they're done feeding. We also have insects that actually feed within the leaf. They're that tiny. And one is out right now, and it's called the European elm flea weevil. Okay, so it is a weevil, has a long snout. Now, do you see the holes in the leaf there? Those kind of notches? That's caused by the adult. The adult overwinters, comes out in the spring, and will feed on the leaves by making these very characteristic notches. In themselves, that isn't a lot of damage. I will admit on some trees it's very unsightly because every leaf will have multiple notches in them. Their favorite food is Siberian elm. And if you go out and look at the Siberian elms in the neighborhoods, you'll notice some of them are almost completely defoliated. Now, some of that was from the frost, but some of it's actually due to this flea weevil, the adults that were feeding. But after they lay eggs, the egg hatches and the larvae is so tiny, it feeds between the upper and lower tissue of the leaf. And that actually causes more damage, more harm to the plant, and is far more noticeable. If you pop one of them open right now, you'll find a very small and startled larvae that's been feeding. Now, the problem with this is that if it's inside the leaf, most of the pesticides are not going to get to it. And that's why one of the treatments for the European elm flea weevil is injecting trees with a systemic product, and there are a number of them out there, that the chemical will be taken up into the leaves, will kill the adults as they're feeding on leaves, but also will kill any larvae. But merely just spraying the leaves isn't going to do a lot when they're in the larval stage. The other thing, too, is that any of the hybrid elms, such as the Vanguard elm, that have Siberian elm in their parentage, are susceptible to this insect. And there's one of the adults. Now, the adults are pretty much fading now because they're out laying eggs, and the eggs are beginning to hatch. And so now you're going to see more of that larval feeding. But remember, it's inside the leaf, so it's protected from any spray that you provide at this time, unless you're applying a chemical that will be absorbed into the leaf. What are our treatments for defoliated insects? And I'm listing them as active ingredients rather than as individual. But acephate as a soil or trunk injection, these are very effective because it's going to be taken up into the leaf and kill anything that feeds on or in the leaf. The bifenthrin are typically foliage sprays, and they're very effective at killing the insect as they're feeding. And of course, emamectin benzoate, which is the chemical we typically use for injecting for emerald ash borer, is also effective at killing defoliators on or in the trees. And then finally, the spinosad, which is typically as a foliage spray. This is a soil bacteria, and it will kill the insect as it feeds. Remember, though, if it's a leaf miner, it's not going to harm them. Well, what about sap-sucking insects? Insects that instead of munching on the leaves, insert a stylus into the leaf and suck the sap out of them. Kind of a equivalent of a mosquito. We have one that we used to see more of, and that's ash plant bug. I am seeing an outbreak of them this year. You are seeing more leaves out there that have this stippling damage to them, where the small insect has pierced the leaf and is sucking the sap out of them. Most people aren't treating the trees anymore because they figure sooner or later they're going to die of emerald ash borer. The interesting thing, if you're treating the tree for emerald ash borer, you will not find this insect because the same chemical is fairly effective at killing the sap-sucking insects, such as this plant bug. But look at the leaves. They just have all this little kind of bronzing or stippling. And all that is this small little insect feeding away by inserting its beak, its stylus, into the plant and sucking up the sap. Now, we have a lot of insects that suck sap. One of the biggest groups are aphids. And I'm seeing a lot of aphids this year. Now, some parts of the state have had an abundance of rain, and that's really providing the conditions that aphids really like. And if an aphid finds conditions it really likes, it can reproduce at an incredibly fast rate. So populations climb very quickly. Now, there's my little drawing of an aphid. 3 pair of legs. The nymphal stage and the adult stage look quite similar. The adults will or may have wings, though not always. There's a couple little features on an aphid which are quite unique. They have what we call tailpipes. These cornicles on the back of the abdomen, they kind of stick up, usually 2. And a lot of people look at those and think that's where honeydew comes from, that sticky substance that aphids produce. No, the cornicles actually emit pheromones. In other words, telling the aphids, hey, run, something's coming in and feeding us, or hey, aphids, come over here. And they also provide defenses. If you ever see a little drop off the cornicles, that's a defense. The honeydew comes out of their anus. That kind of makes it sound tasty, doesn't it? And again, that'll be a sticky material that is on the ground beneath them, and anything like leaves or chairs or anything else. And the reason for that is this insect, through its stylus, its little beak there, inserts it into the leaf, occasionally a shoot, succulent shoot, but inserts its beak in and goes right into the phloem. The phloem is what moves the sugars throughout the plant, and it's actually under positive pressure. So when you tap it, the sap comes right up through. You don't even need to suck it. So they're going to ingest sugars and nitrogen compounds, 2 things they absolutely need to survive, as well as other nutrients, and they'll feed on that very, very easily. And with that, they'll produce this tremendous quantity of honeydew. Sometimes you'll find ants herding the aphids and protecting them because they milk them for this honeydew. And a lot of the aphids will cause a distortion to the leaf as well. So you always get these curls, which, what does that mean? It's going to be awfully hard to spray because they're all inside the curls. So you have to get a pesticide that is systemic, that it will go into the leaf, or one that is at least translaminar, that when you apply to the leaf, actually moves to the other leaf surface that is protected. But aphid populations can build up tremendously fast. Look at this. This is on a viburnum I got called out to look at. Look at all those aphids feeding on the tender shoot of the viburnum. And then if you look, this very big insect there that moves around, and you can see around it the tattered skin of aphids. That's a ladybug larvae. They love to eat aphids. And you might notice just to the left of it, an insect that looks a little bit bigger. That's an ant, a very agitated ant. Because again, they will protect aphids because they do use that honeydew from them. And it doesn't like this wolf, so to speak, coming up and devouring its herd. Well, what about treatments for sap-sucking insects? Again, they're quite similar. Acephate as an injection, bifenthrin as foliage sprays, contacts. The imidacropins you got to be kind of careful with. And the reason for that is if you're applying them to a flowering shrub or tree, a linden, for example, that same chemical can end up in the flowers, and you can end up killing pollinators. So whatever insecticide you use, read and follow label directions very carefully, and be cautious with applying systemic chemicals on plants that are in bloom. If they've already bloomed, that's fine. But if they're blooming now or going to bloom, you got to be careful because you may end up killing non-target insects as well. Well, we have other sap-sucking insects, and they're kind of unique, and these are scales. Scales, the adult, is the immobile stage. It will not move, and what you're looking at there are pine needle scale adults on spruce. They're very poor at tree ID. None of those will move. But you might notice on the one in the center, these kind of almost translucent little elliptical pieces. Those are the crawlers. They're young. What happens is the eggs are laid under the shell of the female scale, and then she dies. And then when the crawlers hatch, they're going to crawl out from beneath their now dead mom and move out onto other tissue to begin to feed. And again, these are sap sucking, and begin to feed. And then after a point, develop a hard shell. And look at this. You can see them. There's the adult scales, and all on that foliage is the small crawlers, and they're the mobile stage. Now, sometimes they move back and forth. Some feed on the needles, some feed on the shoot. So you don't often find them adjacent to the dead mom, but you may find them. By the way, dead mom shells will stay on for several years. So we do get some people that do provide good control, but then they call me and say, wait a minute, I'm still seeing scales. Well, those are the dead scales. What you always look for are scales on the new needles or on the new shoots, the ones that are forming this year when you treat it. If you don't see scales then you probably did a good job of treating them. But here we are. There's the adult mom. She has that hard shell over her. The eggs are laid underneath. She does spend some time feeding. That's her little stylus. And it does feed in the general vicinity of the phloem. I'll cover that in a minute. And then the nymphs, which are crawlers, and they're mobile. They're going to run around and go through several different stages. Now, the armored scales have a shell that completely encloses them, but they're not attached to it. Okay, think of it as a shell over the body. And then you get soft scales where the shell is more of a hardened wax, and it covers the upper body and is attached to the body. In other words, you couldn't separate the two. If you look at the armored scale, they lay tens of eggs. Soft scales lay hundreds of eggs. And the time period in which they lay eggs can differ as well. The armored scales have their eggs hatch over a shorter time period, and the crawlers are mobile for a shorter time period. What does that mean? You need to be more exacting as to when you treat. In other words, when those eggs start to hatch, you need to treat then, because they're going to hatch over a very short time period, and the crawlers are only going to be mobile for a short time period. And after that, once they put that shell over their body, any contact sprays, okay, are going to be very ineffective. They're not going to reach them. Now, systemics will, something you put into the plant, but a lot of our contact sprays, no. The soft scales, they're going to hatch over a longer time period, which may mean multiple applications of an insecticide. The good thing, too, is the crawlers are mobile for a long time. They go from the leaf to the shoot and then back. And that, so you've got a larger window in which you can provide treatments. And there's Dad. Dad actually flies. He looks like a gnat. Interesting enough, Dad's not needed. Scales are parthenogenic. In other words, they can reproduce fertile eggs without Dad being involved. So he's pretty much not needed. Soft scales produce honeydew. Do you see that in the picture? You see that little drip? So sometimes you're looking at a tree or called to a tree and someone says, well, I called you a tree because my tree's weeping, which means honeydew's dripping down from it. The honeydew may be due to aphids, which we've already discussed, and you can see those. But soft scales will also produce honeydew because they feed the same way. So you'll get that little dripping, and then you'll get that honeydew film just all over the leaves, as you see here from cottony maple scale. Oyster shell scale is an armored scale. It does not produce honeydew. This is an infested tree in Pierre. And if you go through Pierre, and you'll notice a lot of declining ash, and it's not due to emerald ash borer. It's due to oyster shell scales. And they seem to have had a big population buildup there for a number of years now, because I can find them so easily. These are harder to tell because, again, it won't be sticky or that underneath it. You actually have to see the shells to them, and they're fairly numerous out there. Now, the other thing, too, is here's oyster shell scale on a aspen out in Rapid. Again, it does not produce honeydew. But you know, one of the things you notice is the bark starts to break up. This is an aspen, but look at how the bark is breaking. And what you're looking at are the scales. Now, not every one of those is alive. Some of those may be fairly old. But if you take a look, you'll see all those little dots there. And again, they're sessile. They're not moving. Those are the adult scales. Now, armored scales feed on cell contents. They're cell busters. So in other words, they pop cells to pull the contents out. So you're not going to get that honeydew. And they form a very hard, waxy shell. And there may be 2 generations per year. The soft scales feed in the phloem just like our other sap-sucking insects. So they are going to produce a honeydew. And they only have 1 generation per year. So the soft scales have their eggs hatch over a longer time period, and there's only going to be 1 generation per year. Where the armored scales, eggs are going to hatch over a shorter time period, and there might be 2 generations. And if we look at their feeding, the armored scales just insert that little beak into the cells surrounding the phloem. All right, and they burst the cells and suck the contents out of them. The soft scales go right into the phloem sieve tubes where the sugars in that are being pumped, and they'll just suck that out. And again, my little diagram of the spray is the honeydew that they excrete. Lucanium scales, very common soft scale. Do you notice that honeydew droplet? Now, by the way, you'll find ants also collecting this from these insects, just more than just aphids. Lucanium scales are kind of reddish to dark brown, like I say, about 1/6 of an inch in diameter. A lot of people wouldn't even notice that they're an insect because, again, they don't move. Now, the eggs hatch at about 770 growing degree days, about the time cockspur hawthorn is finished blooming, which is occurring in a lot of South Dakota right now. Now, if you're watching this live as opposed to a recording, right now we're about 800 to 850 growing degree days in the southeastern part of the state. We're behind this at 600 and some at the northern part of the state, South Dakota, that is. Obviously, a little slower in North Dakota. But if you also look at hawthorn, when it's finishing blooming, you're probably at about 770, which means eggs are hatching. So now it's coming a time period in which it's going to be the most effective time to treat. So if you notice here, the adults lay eggs, the adults die in June. You get those eggs out there. They're going to hatch over a month or more. The crawlers then move out to the leaves and they feed on the other side of the leaves. Then they crawl back to the shoot, overwinter as nymphs, and then become the adults. There is no pupal stage for scales. So they go right from a nymph, become sessile, in other words, become couch potatoes, don't move, become adults, and then lay eggs. So you have a fairly good window there in which to provide treatments as the eggs are hatching and the crawlers are moving out to the leaves. Armored scales are like the oyster shell scale. And again, you can see why it gets the name oyster shell scale. Kind of looks like little oyster shells. They're very small and kind of either gray to brown. They feed on a wide range of plant materials. And ash is a real common one. I took this picture in Rapid City. If you saw that same tree down in Sioux Falls, you'd say, well, that's got to be emerald ash borer. And I stopped to see if it was emerald ash borer, to be honest with you. And when I got up close, nope, it was just scale. Now, it doesn't mean you can't have both, but there was no emerald ash borer in these trees. For many of you, that window is already passed for treatment because egg hatch begins at about 550 growing degree days. And so if you're up in the Aberdeen area or into North Dakota, yes, you still are probably an appropriate time period to treat. If you're down in Sioux Falls, Dakota Dunes, that window has passed. For spray, now it's more of systemics that'll work. Because notice the crawlers are mobile for about a week. And the adults will live for a fairly long, short time period. And then there's eggs over the winter and they hatch. So for these, and again, the eggs overwinter underneath their dead mom, so the shell's still there. But you really want to get that treatment on there just as those eggs are hatching. And for some of you, southeastern part of the state, that window is already passed. Now, pine needle scale is another armored scale, and I showed you this picture earlier. These are kind of shaped like oyster shells again, kind of a white to gray color. You can find them moving on the foliage. Common hosts are Mugo and Scots pines. They will also feed on Colorado and white spruce. There's a picture of a Mugo pine that had such a heavy infestation of pine needle scale. The needles even have a white cast to them. That's not snow hanging on that plant. That light color is just hundreds and hundreds of pine needle scales. The first generation eggs hatch is from about 300 to 500 growing degree days, about when common lilacs in bloom. So throughout South Dakota, this window has probably passed, maybe upcoming in parts of North Dakota. So a spray that you're just spraying the needles to kill the larvae, the nymphs may be passing. They're starting to develop a hardened shell. So you may have to go to a systemic product to really get good treatments. Now, by the way, they can have a second generation. That occurs at about 1,200 to 1,600 growing degrees, about the time false spireas begin to bloom. It's the first generation that causes the most injury to the plant, and that's the one you wanted to treat, or you can still do it with a systemic product. And there is the life cycle of that. Again, when we say eggs overwinter, they're overwintering underneath the shell of the dead adult. We do get a couple of others. There's pine tortoise shell scale out there. It's kind of a reddish brown. You'll find these on Mugo pines and Scots pines. They start hatching at beginning about 600 growing degree days when smoke tree begins to bloom, and they'll hatch over about to about 1,000 when lindens are flowering. So you got a fairly long window to provide treatments for this. And treatments may not be necessary. Natural enemies do most of the work for our sap-sucking insects. Remember I showed you the picture of the ladybug larvae and the aphids? Well, if you ever look at a shell to a scale and you see holes in it like you hear here, that was parasitized. Something killed mom and came out of that shell. All right, that's not where the eggs hatched and the nymphs came out. You find a lot of these when you're looking at twigs or needles in the case of the pine needle scale. You may not need to do any control because whatever control you provide as a chemical may actually end up killing more of what eats the scale than the scale itself. And again, scales, you get pretty good predators out there. There is an adult ladybug, and she's munching away on the pine needle scales in that nymphal stage, not the adults that are there. And she actually did a pretty good job of chowing down on these. And there was quite a few ladybug larvae and adults that were chomping. And so there was really no need to treat. You weren't going to get rid of the scales that were already dead. That's most of what you see here. And they're going to do a job of killing all the crawlers that you can barely see. And in fact, they The next year, the plant looked fairly good. There it is, 2 years later, pretty clean. So one approach to scales, just live with them. Now, I don't know if I'd want to live with a spruce that looked that bad, but the populations tend to come and go. And a one I don't recommend, but you frequently see this in extension bulletins, is go out and scrub them off the bark of plants. I can't think of anyone who has so much free time they can do this. And remember, most of what you're scraping off are dead shells. So removing them is actually not providing any control whatsoever, but nevertheless, it's frequently mentioned. But insecticides get used a lot. Remember, these are difficult to manage because they have that hardened shell. So we tend to do soil injections to it, trunk injections, but a couple of things. The neonics are fairly ineffective on armored scales. So any of the neonic insecticides out there, they're not going to work very well on the armored scale. They're going to work extremely well on the soft scales. So here you have an insect that has two different ways of feeding, cell busters to phloem feeding. And the soft scales are the ones that you can actually do these injections and with the neonics and actually have them work, where the armored scales far less so. There's a few products that do, but not many. So here's one, diteferon. That one's effective against armored scales. It's mobile. You can do it as a soil and trunk injection, though it may take 2 to 3 weeks to reach the canopy of larger trees. So you want to put it on before you really see you're having a major problem. The imidacropins are not effective against armored scales. If you have a soft scale issue, in other words, you're getting the honeydew coming down, these do work either as a soil or trunk injection. But remember, it's going to take maybe a month for that chemical to get up. In fact, some treat in the fall, anticipating a problem in the spring, and that works very well. And then we again have soft products. One of them is Distance. It's an IGR, an insect growth regulator. What it does is prevent the insect from molting. And if you apply that at egg hatch, those little nymphs, as they go to the next form of nymph, so they get a little bit bigger. Remember, they have to burst out of a shell to do that. And by that, I mean just their exoskeleton, not a hardened shell. They're not going to be able to do that. So they're going to kind of burst because they can't get any bigger. Very effective products. Others are horticultural soaps. These are very good on soft scales, crawlers. But note, mountain ash, and that should say horse chestnut. I apologize, I left off the NUT, are very sensitive to soap. So I'll tell you, read and follow label directions, because some of the horticultural soaps are harmful to the plants. And then, of course, there's horticultural oils. Now, notice that the soaps are very effective on soft scale crawlers, where the horticultural oils are better for the armored scale crawlers. But once again, read and follow label directions, because maples are very sensitive to oils. You can scorch them. And on any plant, do not apply when the air temperature is over 85 degrees or greater than 90% humidity. And that's on any plant. So these have fairly narrow windows in which to be using them. So that kind of concludes today, about a 50-minute quick, what are we seeing right now that's feeding on the leaves and needles out there? This last picture is of a stand that was defoliated by the pine loopers. I have, for those of you that are ISA members, I do have the ISA code here. Now, I've had contact from several of you that said, hey, I watched the last one in person and I submitted it and they wouldn't give me credit, and somebody else gets credit. And I talked with the ISA today on it. And what you need to do is write down this title verbatim. Don't change it to anything else. leaf feeding insects, for example, because this is the name associated with that code, DS-23-021. If you write this down, you know, you're self-reporting, you're submitting it to ISA, the date and the code, it should sail right through. And usually when I find when one person had it sail right through and another person did not, it's just not having everything checked off exactly. So the title of this for ISA is Defoliating and Sap-Sucking Insects. You know the date, June 14th, Flag Day. And the code is DS-23-021. If you have a problem with this one, do let me know. Some of you that mentioned the last one, you had a problem because of writing the name down wrong. I'm trying to correct those for you. But for any new ones, this would be it. Since my camera doesn't seem to be working, Tony, I'll probably just leave this picture up rather than have them just look at nothing, or maybe you, which is okay. But do we have any questions?
I don't see any questions at this time. Let's give it another minute or two. Maybe somebody's typing, and we'll see what we have. But
okay. Otherwise, you know, the idea was to let everybody know what they might see now. And as the season progresses, we're going to go through other pests that you may want to be alert for at the time of our discussion. By July, what we're probably going to see are a lot of gall insects. People are going to notice what's the little ball on the leaf or on the stem or that. And so we'll focus on those in the July Zoom session from Forest Health.
Perfect. Well, no questions have popped up. I have added a link to our Forest Health Workshop series on the YouTube channel. You can find that in the chat box. I did see one question pop up here quick, Dr. Ball. What might I see in a plum?
In a plum is two things. You may be seeing plum cucurio. They laid eggs a little bit ago, and I am seeing some fairly small larvae inside of plum. Now, the other thing you might find in a plum is a fungal disease, and it causes the plum to kind of be spongy, but that's probably not what you're trying to describe to me. So if you're finding a small insect,
soft.
What's that?
You put a little description in there saying the fruits are soft and a caterpillar on the leaves.
Those two may be unrelated then.
Right.
The caterpillar on the leaf might be one of the 10 caterpillars. Yep. And then we do get a disease of plums, plum pockets it's called. And it's called pockets because the fruit will become very spongy and there will not be a stone inside. So I think what you're looking at is a fungus disease causing plum pockets, and it's too late to treat, and an insect that just happens to be out there at the same time, but is completely unrelated.
Good point to bring up also, just that just because you see one or you see multiple things, there could always be multiple things going on one tree, I guess.
Exactly.
One more question about box elder bugs. Anything that can be done about them?
You know, a lot of us see more of them as an annoyance than anything else, and the usual practice of screening in that to try to keep them from entering the house. They're going after the seeds in that quite often, so a lot of our systemics don't work, and so you would need to use a contact pesticide, one that you spray and it kills them as they're walking. There's a number of products out there that are available to do that, but my caution always, because we have to speak in general terms on these, is to make sure read and follow label directions. When you're into the garden center looking at pesticides, make sure it is labeled for, sometimes it'll just say bugs, but it's labeled for maples, which a box elder is. But you have to spray and hit the insect.
Well, that looks like that wraps up our questions, and that will conclude our June issue of the Forest Health Workshop Series. Thanks, Dr. Ball. Thank you to everybody who joined us, and we'll see you in July.
All right. Thanks, everybody.